All right. Let's get started, everybody, with today's meeting. Before we do our roll call, I just want to remind everyone, although at the moment, we might have a couple people on Zoom. If you have a question for our presenters or anything like that, please make sure to turn your microphone on that's in front of you. If you're in the room, you just have to hit the little button to turn it on. If the red light is lit up, it's on. If it's not lit up, it's not on. So when you're done with your question, turn it off or we'll hear you breathing or sneezing or whatever else is going on. All right, getting started. Let's do our roll call.
Member Bartlesmeyer, Member Delonte, here. Member Sturman, here. Member Berger, Member Patton, Member Bramman, Member Donaldson, Co-Chair Holthouse, Miss Councilmember Edens
here.
Co-Chair Holthouse is here, and Co-Chair Farmer
Here.
Thank you.
All right, everybody's here. I don't have too much to say. It's been a little while here since we've met, but I think we've got, looking forward to our presentation tonight. I think we maybe have some other exciting news that's coming. So it's a good time for us all to get back together and get reacquainted with what we're doing. Carol, you got anything you want to add?
I'm going to implement a personal policy of not having my grandchildren sleep over the weekend before a committee meeting. So once again, I'm very croaky. And my hearing is also very poor. So if you ask me a question and I don't respond, feel free to, if you're going to throw something, just please make sure it's something kind of soft. I appreciate it.
All right. Before we get to an approval of the minutes, I also just wanted to mention that our guest is hung up in traffic a little bit. Oh, nope, she made it. So never mind. We're good. We're going to go with it as it is. So would anyone like to make a motion to approve the minutes from way back in January? Or wasn't there? Perfect.
I'll move.
Excellent. We got a second? Mr. Stern, second. Perfect. All right. All those in favor of the approval of the minutes?
Aye.
Aye. Anyone abstain? Lauren? Anybody not approving? Perfect. Okay. At this point, we've got our public comment section. We have a few guests in the room. I also see somebody attending online, which is great. Would any of you guys like to speak at the public section? No? Perfect. All right, moving on. We've got a presentation from our friends at the USGS, and we're just so excited to see it. Mr. Vunich, please set us up.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, we do have two guests from the United States Geological Survey. Dr. Leroy is the study leader, and I believe she'll be starting the presentation. And then, of course, I think you all recognize Paul Rudland. He is the gentleman that kind of teed up the study for us and created this wonderful partnership that we have relative to the Cox Creek Watershed. And so with that, we do have a presentation that was provided by Dr. Leroy. We are going to share a screen. And so hopefully on your monitors, that'll come across a little clearer than what typically happens behind you. Also, before we have Dr. Leroy come to the podium, for those members that aren't aware, we have an interim city administrator, Mr. Lee, and you don't mind, Mr. Chair, if he could maybe introduce himself and so that they can associate a face with
Absolutely.
the name.
Well, pleasure to meet everyone today. I'm excited to be here and get more involved in this task force. And not only that, great, like Councilmember Farmer was stating, it's a great day to have this convene because we have some pretty good news. I guess I'll wait for that in a little bit, but I'll be able to provide some more information. But excited to hear the presentation and excited to be here, guys. Thank you.
Excellent.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for having me here today. I'm here to give a bit of an update on the USGS study that is ongoing right now. And I just want to take a moment to acknowledge the other people who have contributed to this work: David Hyman, Tyler Burke, Charlie Segrand, and Kyle Hicks. It's very much a group effort. Okay, it does work. So just to refresh your memories, there are a few different components to the study that we're doing. There's the boots on the ground field monitoring of the erosion that's occurring at the 6 study areas that are kind of highlighted in gray on the side of the screen. The year 1 data has been collected and processed, and we've provided the city with some preliminary results on that I'll also show a little bit of in the latter half of the presentation. Our second year first survey has been collected. The processing of that is in progress. And of course, the second survey for this 2023 year will be planned for late summer after the spring and summer rains have come through. The other main component of the study are the 3 modeling pieces. There's a hydraulic modeling piece that kind of goes together hand in hand. So those models have been calibrated, validated, and we've done all the simulations that we had planned on doing. I'm going to show some results from those today. The analysis is still in progress. We haven't fully completed, but I do have some preliminary results that we're pretty excited to show you today. And then finally, now that we do have the hydraulic modeling complete, we can get going on the bank stability modeling. And I actually just saw some great presentations at the conference I'm here for today on the software that we're going to use for that. So that's pretty exciting too. Yeah, thank you. So again, just to refresh your memory, we are focusing on the reach of Cox Creek that contains the areas of concern that were previously identified by the city. And within this study area, the flow is intermittent. It only flows after rainfall, although there may be standing water in some areas. The bed sediment's really coarse. It's large cobbles, gravel, and pebbles. And the bank geometry, material, and vegetation vary substantially. And I think I've talked previously with this group about how I think that's a really important piece of the puzzle in this study, which is, what are the sort of material and properties of the banks that contribute to their stability. And this is a slide that was borrowed from a presentation to the conference. You're all well aware of the bank stabilization project in the area, as well as the riprap installations that are there. So some preliminary results from our hydrologic and hydraulic modeling, and I'm grouping those together because it's they kind of go hand in hand to give the results that I'm going to show. And so this part of the study is focused on understanding how climate change and hypothetical added storage in the basin is going to affect the peak flow. So basically how much water is flowing through at the peak of the hydrograph in response to a storm, as well as the total volume of water that flows through the stream in response to a storm, as well as how those things, climate change and added storage, affect the distributions of velocity and shear stress in the channel. And those are the kinds of parameters that we're interested in when we think about river erosion. Those are going to be related to how much force the river can exert on its boundaries. Can you advance, please? Thank you. So this slide is showing the way we've built up the scenarios that we're looking at. We're looking at a lot of different scenarios that relate both. So we've got our climate scenarios, so our current climate, as well as 4 future climate scenarios. And I'll go through what those mean in just a minute. As well as different design storms. So when I say a design storm, it's like a theoretical storm that lasts for a particular duration. So we're looking at 6-hour duration or 24-hour duration that on average occurs. We've got our recurrence intervals. So it may occur on average every 2, 5, 10, 25, up to 100 years. So the less frequent storms are going to be your more intense storms. We're also looking at scenarios, different scenarios for how what's going on in terms of soil moisture in the basin. That's our antecedent response conditions. I apologize for the jargon there. So basically, if the watershed is wet to begin with, more of your rainfall is going to end up in the river, as opposed to we're also modeling a normal condition, sort of an intermediate condition. And then finally, we did all combinations of all those different pieces, puzzle pieces on the slide for the existing storage conditions. And then we've also done simulations with the current climate scenarios where we've looked at adding detention and retention storage. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a few slides. For the climate scenarios, we've looked at 4 different future climate scenarios. That RCP, that stands for representative concentration pathway, that refers to the emissions scenario. And you can just think of the 4.5 as sort of a middle of the road intermediate climate change scenario, and 8.5 as a worst case climate change scenario. And then we're looking at both those intermediate and the worst case for 2050 and 2099. There we go. So in this part of the world, climate change is expected to result in greater total rainfall for a given design storm. And so just to summarize what we've got for the scenarios we're looking at here, we're seeing percent increases on the order of 6 to 10% increase in total rainfall in 2050 for a given design storm. And by 2099, that goes up because the trends continue over time. And the predictions we have indicate a 9% to 24% increase in total rainfall for a given design storm. So as you might expect, more rainfall is going to lead to higher peak flows and greater total runoff volume. And I'm not showing every single scenario we've simulated. This is just an example where we've got the 6-hour storms with normal soil moisture prior conditions. And what we're seeing is that the increases in peak flow and total runoff volume kind of track with the increases that we are predicted for rainfall total, which is exactly what we'd expect. I did put that yellow bar on this plot that shows sort of the range of observed annual peak flows in the system. So that the sort of the 10-year current climate scenario flow is at the top end of what's been observed so far. So that might just give you a little bit of context on some of the later slides for what that looks like. Okay. For the scenarios that we looked at adding reservoir storage, again, we only did that for current climate scenarios. We didn't look at future climate scenarios. But so this slide is showing what currently exists in our model and in the basin for in terms of reservoirs. And there's one large reservoir that's upstream from the areas of concern. It's that on the slide, it's the lowermost pin labeled 101. All those other pins on that slide are actually downstream from the areas of concern. So they're not going to affect what's going on in the areas of concern. So what we did with our hypothetical added storage is we added storage that's equal to what's currently in Reservoir 101. So it effectively doubles the amount of storage upstream from the areas of concern. And so this is just kind of a proof of concept to see if adding any reservoir storage would have a substantial effect. And we did 2 different scenarios for this, both detention and retention. So that the difference there is mainly with the detention scenarios, you can think of the reservoir as starting out empty. And with the retention scenarios, the reservoir starts out partially filled, in this case at 3/4 max pool. And what we found is that adding reservoir storage does reduce peak flows pretty substantially in some of the scenarios. The amount varies depending on the scenario, as you might expect. And again, I'm not showing everything here, but I pulled out some sort of representative numbers. So if we look at the percent reduction in the peak flow at the upstream end of the study area, we see a pretty big range in how much of a reduction we see, from about 5-6% all the way up to 65%. And what we see is that the percent reductions are highest for our lower intensity, shorter storms, which are expected to occur more frequently. And they're also highest for scenarios where we start with normal soil moisture conditions as opposed to wet. Further downstream, so I've got numbers for the percent reduction in peak flow at the downstream end of the study area. Further downstream, there's more of the watershed that's contributing to that point, and the effect of the reservoirs is going to be relatively diminished, but it's still substantial, up to 27% in some cases. Those really low percent reductions occur for some of the longer storms that we simulated and the really large storms that we simulated, where the amount of volume that they can hold just is a bit of a drop in the bucket, you could think of. All right. In the interest of time, I'm only showing a little bit of our results on velocity and shear stress, but I do have extra slides if you're interested. Feel free to ask. So this is a little bit of a complicated plot. So I'm going to start with the takeaway message, which is that, as you would expect, our future climate scenarios where they've got greater rainfall, greater peak flows, have faster velocities and greater shear stress throughout most of the study area. There are a few locations where we've got flows getting up so high that they'd start to spill out a lot, or perhaps back up behind a raised road. And that's where we start to see some reductions in velocity relative to current scenarios. But throughout most of the channel, we see an increase. And so what these plots are showing here, I'll walk through now. So the x-axis is our distance along the channel in feet. So marching from upstream to downstream. And I've got the study reaches highlighted in gray on the plot too, and those correspond to what's shown on the center line that's drawn on the right side of the screen. And then on the top plot, we've got our y-axis is the average velocity just in the channel. So it's only looking at what's inside the channel, even in the cases where the flow goes out. And so this is what we would call a profile of velocity through the whole center line of the stream through the study area. And so, for example, I'll point out the 10-year current. That's this green line here. That's the scenario that kind of corresponds to the highest observed peak flow at the gauge. And the yellow line above it is the sort of worst case future scenario. We're looking at the 2099 RCP 8.5. So that's the furthest in time away and the worst case emissions scenario. So we've only got two different climate scenarios on here, just sort of the two end members. So that's showing velocity. What's interesting here, what you might have noticed in looking at it, is that the peaks don't necessarily line up with your areas of concern, the places where you've seen issues. They tend to occur in relatively straight, narrow reaches where the flow is confined and not necessarily able to spill out onto the floodplain. Whereas those areas of concern, all of them except maybe 3, which is a bridge location, they're all places where the channel has experienced substantial widening in recent history. So that's a wide spot. That's where flow is going to potentially slow down because it's got more room in the channel. There are also more twisty, sinuous spots where the slope might not be so great. And so when you think about it in that way, it makes sense that we may not see such strong peaks in those areas of concern, which is, I'll now bring your attention to the bottom plot, which is showing shear stress. And so shear stress is a parameter that's used to measure the force that the flow exerts on the channel bed. So how strongly is it shearing along the channel bed? And I've drawn 2 lines on here. The lower one is the shear stress that's required to move 1/2-inch sediment, which is like the size of a chickpea, maybe, give or take. And so, as I mentioned a little earlier, the sediment in the channel is fairly coarse on the bed. It's, cobbles, gravel. There is some sand and chickpea-sized grains, so some of that may be mobilized throughout the whole channel in any of these flows. But the sediment in some of the banks is much finer and would be potentially be mobilized at lower shear stresses as well. So what we see here is that throughout the whole channel, the flow is able to move that sort of chickpea size sediment and anything potentially finer, unless it's really sticky and cohesive like mud. I have also drawn on here the shear stress that's needed to move 5-inch sediment, so maybe like the size of a slice of bread. And you can see in that case, you need sort of those stronger, bigger rainfall events to start to mobilize that kind of sediment throughout most of the channel. But what's important to you all here, I think, is the bank erosion. And so the ability to start to erode those banks throughout most of the channel, all of these flows are kind of competent to do that. That's the word we'd use. Let's see, I think that's all I wanted to say on that. And again, I've got more results to show on that if you'd like to delve a little deeper. I do want to point out some of the limitations of this work. This kind of hydraulic modeling, it's only sort of giving us one side of the equation. It's that how strong the flow is, what's our driving force for erosion. It doesn't address the factors that resist erosion, like the strength of the material in the banks. And it also doesn't address erosion that occurs in the absence of flowing water. So we'd call that a mass failure, where a bank just collapses under its own weight. And bank stability is affected by a whole variety of factors. And that's some stuff that we'd like to start to address with the bank stability modeling. We just don't have results for that yet. Another big limitation here is that we've built our model from a 2017 LIDAR terrain data. We updated it with some data we collected in 2022, but we're using that to simulate potential to 2050, 2099, 100 years out. And we know that this channel is changing. And so, how different might that channel actually look in those years? So you do need to take those results with a bit of a grain of salt. And then finally, it gets a little more in the weeds, but it's a two-dimensional model. So we don't fully capture 3D processes that are occurring in really sharp bends or around bridge piers. So there's some things that this approach misses. But some of the main takeaways, we do see these big increases in peak discharges predicted for our 2099 design storms compared to current climate conditions. But we've found that adding detention or retention storage could potentially reduce peak flows, particularly for those higher frequency, lower intensity storms. We also found that velocity and shear stress are, as we might expect, higher for our future climate scenario compared to current throughout most, but not all of the channel. And all of the scenarios that we modeled with our existing storage situation can move that chickpea-sized sediment throughout the whole reach and likely erode any finer sediment from the banks. As I mentioned on the previous slide, those peaks in longitudinal profiles of velocity and shear stress don't necessarily align with the areas of concern. And that makes sense when we think through the physical processes that are controlling velocity and shear stress. But since those flows are so erosive, even though it's not peaking in those areas, it's still probably erosive in those areas. And then finally, that point that the mass failure processes, the factors that affect bank stability, are going to be really important here in why erosion occurs where it does. And again, we're going to try and get at that with some of the bank stability modeling, also looking at some of the historical aerial imagery and where we've observed erosion in the past. I do have some of the results from our terrestrial LIDAR and bank pin erosion monitoring, but I wanted to give the opportunity if anyone had a question on the modeling work. I can keep forging forward or move on to the next topic. Great. So some results from our 2022 surveys. So this slide is showing our changes in the bank pin measurements. These numbers are in centimeters. And each column is showing for a given bank pin what the change was from one survey to the next. So that first column is from March to May, May to July, July to October. And then we've got the 2022 total change in this column here. And in this table, the negative values indicate erosion, positive values indicate deposition. The bank pins, the locations are shown on the map. They're these black arrows, and they're numbered, and the numbers correspond to the numbers here. So throughout most of the channel, we made a point of putting most of these in places where we are not doing the terrestrial LiDAR surveys. This is sort of to give us an idea of what's going on in the rest of the channel. And we see pretty small amounts of change on those. The ones that are in blue here, those are the 3 bank pins that we put in our terrestrial LiDAR survey areas that are known problem areas. And that's where we see much greater values on the order of 25, 20 centimeters over the course of the 2022 surveys. And those are just point measurements, single point measurements, and there can be quite a bit of spatial variability. So just keep that in mind. So our terrestrial LiDAR surveys, we did the first set in February and March of 2022. The second set, most of them we got in July of 2022, except for the triple meander section we did in August, which that was lucky because that peak of record for the year occurred before we did the triple meander, but unfortunately it was after all the others. And we did our first 2023 survey in the week of February 27, but I don't have results from that yet. So I'm not gonna, again, I'm just kind of showing examples here and there because to show everything, I think we'd be here till midnight, but I'll walk through a couple examples from each, an example from each of the study reaches. So this is study reach 1. That's Hope Montessori School over here, just kind of key you into where the location is over here. And in this image where you see blue, that's where we've got erosion. So we're sort of like viewing from up, looking down into the first bend in this section here, looking at that cut bank. And we observed erosion on the order of up to 1.6 meters of bank retreat in that area. Further downstream, I don't have an image of it here, but there is a stormwater culvert that empties or outflow runoff pipe that empties into the channel around that location. And we did see erosion around that as well. You can go to, see if I can do it. There we go. Study reach 2, that's the famous triple meander. And this is the site where we saw the greatest rates of erosion. And that's A, expected because of those tight meander bends, but B, also expected because this was after that peak of flood of record, the annual peak that occurred in early August. And again, where you see blue, that's erosion. So this is sort of viewed looking down and into that first bend here. So you see quite a bit of erosion on that very tall vertical bank where there's no protection from vegetation or anything. And so in that first bend, we measured up to 3.8 meters of erosion, highest in this study. On the second bend, up to 1.6, and on the third, up to 0.6-ish meters of erosion. Yeah. That's from the February, March 2022 to, in this case, August, what was it? August 9th, 2022. Less than a year. But we expect a lot of the erosion to occur in a particular, it doesn't necessarily slowly occur at a constant rate over time. It occurs in large episodic chunks. So you may have a flow that comes through that erodes at the toe of the bend. And then, so that may erode the toe of the bend, even if it doesn't get up all the way on the banks. And then when that's gone, now you've got an unstable bank and you may see a large mass failure. That's where you get those really fast rates. Yeah. Yep. In this site. And that's the max value as measured at the points that are a little hard to see here. I am working on some longer term estimates based on historical aerial imagery to put these values in context. So I don't have those here today, but I think that'll help a lot. For the next study reach, this is one of our bridge sites, so it's not a place where bank retreat was noted as a major issue. We did have some trouble at this site getting good difference results because vegetation is really obscuring the banks quite a bit, and there's a lot of standing water. And so because of this, we've made the decision in future surveys and including this past February to collect some data with a total station, which is a more traditional surveying piece of equipment as opposed to the LiDAR, because the LiDAR can't see through that water. And while the LiDAR gets us these really dense, beautiful point clouds to compare, if we can't see through the water, it doesn't really help much. So we decided to sort of sacrifice that point density a little bit to be able to survey under the bridge and get into the water and potentially see if we can see if there's scour occurring in that area with standing water. So there's not a whole lot to say from the 2022 results here. Study Reach 4, this is a location where there's been quite a bit of widening over the historical aerial imagery for sure. And that bears out in the LiDAR data as well. So depending on where you are in this bend, you may, or where you take the point measurement off the LiDAR difference, there's some places of erosion, some places of deposition on the bed. But I'll point your eye, it's a little hard to see. So there's 0.2 and 0.3 here. 0.2 has a difference of about 0.5 meter. 0.3 has a difference of positive 34 centimeters. And so I think I talked about this last time, this idea of, and again, I mentioned it earlier, this idea of the fluvial erosion sort of attacking the toe of the bank, and then subsequent mass failures of large blocks falling down. And you can see these slump blocks. So this sort of paired erosion deposition along the vertical of a bank is something that we're seeing at this site. We're also seeing the effect of some fallen trees in this area near 7 and 8. So that the flow around the tree that generates a lot of turbulence, which can create scour. Study Reach 5, we've got a fair bit of erosion occurring kind of near the entrance to the bend. So that's this 0.1 here, where 0.85 meters of erosion was observed. There was not very much change observed near the bridge. Maybe a little bit of bank erosion on the left bank downstream from the bridge. Be interesting to see what we see in the 2023 surveys. And then Study Reach 6, we could break this one down into a few different reaches, but for the sake of time, I just pulled out this bend here, location 13B is shown here again, sort of viewed obliquely. And where you see the blue is where there's observed erosion. And again, these are some pretty substantial erosion rates on the order of 2 meters, 2.5 meters over that period of time. And this one was surveyed before that big August flow event. So as far as what was going on down around the bridge, this was another place where the vegetation on the banks just made it really hard to identify what was actually the bare surface below that vegetation in the LiDAR data. So that's all I had planned to talk about today. I'm happy to answer questions. I'm happy to show some of the other data I have here, but I know that you've got limited time. So
first, I'd like to compliment you on how much progress you've made, how much data you've shared in a comprehensible form. So appreciate all that good work. I know that the goals of this survey are long-term and, baseline and modeling and predictive. But those of us that have been on the committee for a while are really impatient to find some actionable items. So I went through your preliminary report, and where we see something like there's an exposed culvert, is that something we should be, jumping on now and doing some sort of, you're out there, you see these things, should we be putting together some plans for some, quick mitigation steps is my question.
That's a really good question. And I think it is very tempting to think about sort of addressing those point locations of where you're seeing problems. I think what's sort of most interesting to me in terms of things that are actionable are the work that we've done with looking at the hypothetical added storage and the effect that that is having on peak flows. I've not had a chance yet to look at the effect on velocity and shear stress. And same goes with the bank stability modeling. That's going to be really, really important here, I think. But I would caution against hasty fixes in a single point location. We know that putting riprap in a single point location or concrete in a single point location may help in that single point location, but it can exacerbate issues in the surrounding area as well. So yeah, that's I think the added storage modeling is going to be the most actionable work that we have coming out of this.
The other thing I wondered, again, and I appreciate your honesty, and we do know that it's important not to lose focus and, stay on the big ticket items, and there's a million things we could do. We've got to make some choices, but, there's also a lot of, locations where you're saying it's a tree that's fallen in, or it's a, the material's been removed and the roots are still there. Would any kind of a tree, a more systemic getting in there and removing these things as a policy make a difference or not?
I mean, I would say on the balance, the trees are really helping you.
Okay.
That trees with deep roots provide a lot of stability to a bank compared to the places where you've got the observed erosion historically. Those are places where you've just got grass. And so the vegetation that has deeper roots is going to provide more stability in the bank, even if occasionally a tree falls in and there's local scour around it.
Would doing something about the trees that fall in make a difference at that point, or is it not really worth going after?
So that's an interesting question. So there's some local scour on the bed around the trees, but you can also think of those trees as providing some protection for the bank nearby because they slow the flow.
Okay.
So yeah, there's a lot of different layers to the role of large, what we call large woody debris in streams, and there's a lot of ecological benefits to it as well. So yeah, and it's hard to make recommendations too. We can observe what's happening. What's happening currently, and we can look back at historical aerial photographs, but it's really hard to say if you do X, then Y will happen in this one particular spot.
I also noticed that there were several places where you talked about riprap moving, and again, in a relatively, short period of time for what we hope the life expectancy of these, mitigation projects will be. Do we need to be thinking about some annual budget money that says, we know these things are going to be adjusted by the creek's going to change and it's going to move some things over time, even if the design is, perfect when it's installed. So do we need to be really thinking not only in terms of the upfront capital costs, but in terms of ongoing maintenance costs?
That's a really good question. I think it would kind of be beyond my role.
Okay.
So I can give you the science, but I think in terms of decisions about.
All right. Well, thank you for being patient with me.
No,
You're far
very good
outside the scope
questions.
of the charge you were given, but appreciate your expertise for helping us stay focused.
Any other questions?
Lauren.
So I think my question is perhaps premature and can probably be better answered by the bank stabilization modeling that you're going to be doing. So feel free to tell me that. But as I was sitting here thinking about the areas where, like AOC1, where we had a pretty significant amount of erosion occur. And as I'm thinking about that erosion eating farther and farther into the protective tree line, at some point, I would have to think that a lesser storm or the same storm in terms of rainfall would cause an exponentially greater loss of bank because the bank's scape, for lack of a better word, changed. So perhaps you're getting closer and closer to grass. So I was just wondering, will that bank modeling tell us how much more likely we are to have mass failures in certain areas that or I mean, there's so many variables. I don't know how that works.
There are a lot of variables, and it can be overwhelming to think about the number of scenarios and what that all means. And part of my job is to try and digest that down to something that makes sense and is useful. What we'll be able to do with the bank stability modeling is tell you what amount of bank retreat you might expect from a particular flow event. Now, in terms of what event is going to cause more problems, it becomes tricky because really, really large events move a lot of sediment, can be really erosive, but they happen infrequently. Whereas a smaller event maybe moves less in a given flow, but if it's happening twice a year, 3 times a year, it may end up doing the same amount of total movement of sediment as that really big event. And there are ways to get at those questions, but it's beyond the scope of the current study. Yeah.
What would that take to do a study that included that scope?
Yeah, so that's a good question too. So I think we have some of the foundation for doing that with the model that we have. So it would involve doing a larger suite of the bank stability modeling, and then perhaps looking back historically about those magnitude frequency relationships for those different flows, and trying to actually piece together how much sediment a given flow moves in a given year, and try to build those relationships out. So I think it's something that we have laid the foundation potentially to do, but it would require a lot more looking at the historical gauge records.
If we decided to do that as a city, would it be helpful to do that before you do additional modeling, or is that something that could be added on for an additional price at a later time, or is this something that we would want to, budget for and sort of re-up sooner than later?
It could potentially be useful. So when we start thinking about the effects of that hypothetical added storage, and we found that the amount of reduction in peak flow depends a bit on the scenario. And so understanding which scenarios are going to be most problematic in terms of erosion, and does the added storage, do you get your bang for your buck with the added storage on those? It could help answer those questions, but I think, again, that's something I would have to leave to you all to decide how you want to prioritize that work.
Okay. I would be interested in exploring that further. So when I'm looking at the agenda, the way it's kind of broken down, it's implied that this is for action, but I'm not sure that it technically is not a for information item. So I mean, without objection, rather than a formal motion, it might be nice for staff to discuss with USGS increasing the scope and putting what that additional cost would be on a future agenda. Thank you.
Or I mean, I guess maybe Joe, you would know the answer to this. Like, would it be possible for us to come up with some general idea of what that might be, and then rather than waiting for us to reconvene to talk about it, if we feel generally like that might be a good idea, we could pass that immediately to the council and let the council determine if that's an amount of money that we can take on or not. Does that make sense?
It does make sense, and certainly maybe tonight, just an endorsement that if we do get information back from USGS about expanding or amending the study, that you're comfortable enough if we provide it to you an email for us to proceed forward to city council without a stop here, so to speak.
All right. So Lauren, I assume you want to make that motion?
If it is appropriate to do so.
I think
Yes,
that
I
would be
would.
fine. Would anybody care to second that?
Especially because we have mid-year budget adjustments
Right.
coming up. Not that we're going to find a pot of gold, but we might.
Right.
We haven't checked every rainbow.
So Travis, you got the motion? The first and the second? All right, I think we can probably do this with a voice vote. Let's see if that'll work. So all in favor, everybody understand the motion we're going with? So the idea in general terms is to have the city staff work with the USGS to find out, one, if it's appropriate to expand what they're doing to look into some of these additional studies. with a number affixed to it. We don't know what that number is, but we would be saying in general, we're okay with that. And then it would go to the council. And so if the number's, $1 million or whatever, the council's going to say no. They may say no if it's $10,000. I don't know.
What's the actual explanation? What's the actual explanation of what you take forward?
What the council takes forward.
No, what we're going to take
So
forward.
we're just going to say all we're doing is saying we endorse this idea to go directly to the council with this information rather than to come to us to say, yes, we think the council should decide on that study. Primarily because we've got budget changes happening right now. So if we want to do it, we kind of need to.
All right, but it's my understanding, if I heard Lauren correctly, is that we're talking about an addition here to what they've already done. And then you asked a question about what would it take to do something that you haven't dealt with yet? Is that correct?
Yeah, so they're still working on the bank stabilization modeling.
Yes.
So I am asking to increase the scope of what they will bring back.
Okay, and do we need to be more specific in words as to what that is? That's what I'm missing is what is the addition?
It sounded like additional LiDAR data, historic rainfall data, and computer modeling.
So it would be an analysis of historical flow data and perhaps, yes, some additional bank stability modeling. And I think on our end, we would have to come back and together a plan of work, a proposal, because right now this is just sort of off the top of my head.
That's fine.
So we would put together proposed budget and all that and provide it to you all.
Yeah. Essentially, we're at the process where we're at the bakery counter and I'm saying 6 donuts are great, but a dozen would have been better. And I'd rather buy them at once.
Okay, I'm okay with that. I was unclear as to the wording about what are we taking forward. That's all. And if she clarifies that, because you're going to have to do something on paper to the council that says,
they'll have to come back with a whole proposal.
With a proposal. Okay, thanks.
Joe, did you have anything you wanted to add?
No, sir. The Mr. Delante's question and the response from Dr. Leroy kind of galvanized what I was thinking as well. So thank you both.
Perfect. All right. Any other question? Okay. All those in favor of the city staff and the USGS working together to come up with perhaps a greater plan to the council, please say aye.
Aye.
Anyone opposed? Any abstention? All right. We're good on that. Does anybody have any other questions about what we've been learning so far? Yes, ma'am.
I'm sure you said this and I missed it. What does RCP stand for?
It stands for Representative Concentration Pathway. And so when the IPCC does their climate modeling, they look at a whole variety of emissions scenarios. And so the two that we pulled out are kind of like a middle of the road and a worst case scenario. Just we thought that would be the most useful in terms of your planning because we can't do them all,
Right. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
I do have a question for Dr. Leroy, if that's acceptable to the task force.
Absolutely.
So there was the one graph that showed the velocity and shear stress relative to those lines for the 6 study locations. And just a quick review, it seemed like the velocity and shear stress occurred before the 3 of the study locations, and then conversely, after, or 3 occurred after the study locations. And so there didn't seem to be a reasonable pattern to it.
So that's a really good, you're picking up on something that popped out to us immediately when we looked at this data as well.
Yeah, that's it.
So what we're seeing here is a couple of different things. So first of all, this is one side of sort of our scale of what's driving the erosion. And it doesn't include the resistive forces. So the places where you may be seeing those, so this spot in particular, actually, in between SR1 and SR2, is really fast because it's really narrow and it's really straight and it's heavily vegetated banks. And the flow does not spill out onto the floodplain very much. Actually, I'm going to advance to there we go. I think I might have a slide in here that shows that area in more detail. Okay, that's the difference. So, okay, so this is that triple meander reach here. Oh, the colors don't show up great. So, but this is that really fast area you see. So we've got, first of all, we've got a bridge here, which usually bridges create constrictions where flow speeds up. But we've got this really straight, narrow reach, and it's spilling out onto the floodplains a little bit, but compared to over here, it's confined. And so you're forcing that same amount of water through a narrow, smaller area. So it's going to have to move faster to get through. And so potentially you're not seeing erosion issues there because we've got, again, this is a hypothesis. We don't know this for sure. We have not looked at the sediment in detail, but potentially those banks are more resistant to erosion, either because of the vegetation, what the bank material is composed of, because it's really variable in this river. There are some areas that it's just all fine material. There are some areas, I know in this reach, there's rock, which is not going to erode as easily. It may be a combination of those factors. Even the geometry of the bank is important in terms of mass failures. So, so we're not necessarily seeing an alignment between where we have the fastest flows and where you're seeing the problem areas, because the fast flows is only one side of the equation. We're missing the what's resisting erosion side with that. The other thing I'll add is that I'll go back to my first plot here. Go, almost there. So just because the velocity may be slower doesn't mean it's not able to mobilize sediment in those areas of concern. So throughout that whole channel for all these scenarios, the flow can move that kind of pea gravel, the chickpea size sediment. And in areas where the banks may be sandy or they may be fine material, the sediment, the flow is going to be able to erode those banks, even if it's not the fastest part of the channel. And so it's those bank characteristics that are going to be really important too. And I'm hoping in the final report that I'll be able to make those points clear in showing what we can see in the historical aerial imagery where we've seen erosion in the past, some photographs from the field of what those banks look like. And again, the bank stability modeling, I think, will highlight some of that.
I guess my assumption would have been that all of those peaks in the lines would have occurred before the problem areas, not necessarily after. Mm-hmm. So I don't know if that's wrong, but it's just a curious thing to see.
Right. Yeah. The velocity in the channel is going to depend on a variety of factors, but the main ones are what's the slope? So that's gravity. How strong is gravity pulling the water down? So what's the slope in that area? And how big is the channel? So do you have a small pipe or a big pipe? And then also roughness, how rough, what's the friction in the channel that's dragging the flow and potentially slowing it down. And I think I mentioned this earlier, but I didn't bring it in now, but in places where we've seen a lot of widening historically, you have flow that may be more confined, and then it goes into this wider area and it can slow down a little bit, but still potentially be able to erode the banks. That makes sense. We scratched our heads a little bit when we pulled this data out too. So
if I was interpreting that picture of where it's at correctly, that's at Point Clayton, right? Where the banks are like 30 feet tall.
Yeah. So the peak in velocity is like right upstream of that triple meander near Point Clayton. And then you can actually see within those bends, those peaks are associated with the bends there. Those first two bends are those peaks you tend to get high velocity in those bends as well. That's related to the curvature of the channel. Yeah.
I think this just underscores how important it is to add the scope where we start looking at not only what's going on in the channel, but what's, containing that flow, and looking at the bank, and the stability of that is, I think, really critical as well.
Mr. Sturman.
Yeah, and it may be the Wilsons would be the ones to get involved with a question I have or a thought I have. And the thought I have may be a really bad one, I don't know, or an unrealistic one. But at the infamous triple meander, and it makes common sense, that first band takes by far the largest impact. Once it hits that bank, it slows down as it goes around the rest of the three meanders. And it appears, and it would make sense, it's really moving the bank back because of that impact. Now, we have a lack of money. And so I was thinking, would it make any sense at all? And would it be make sense from an engineering standpoint over time if one installed a bank system, erosion control system, just in that curve for now, to try to preserve that triple meander from becoming a disaster? I don't know if that makes good engineering sense or not. And I don't know what the cost would be to do that, but that's one thought I have.
Yeah, that's a bit beyond what I can pull out of the results of this particular study.
Yeah, I think we talked about at one point doing that, and then it just kind of transfers the problem to the next part. So, I mean, it would be an incremental thing, but we would be certainly causing some issues. All right. Anybody have anything else? I have a quick one that is probably not going to necessarily be found in your data. It's more of an opinion question. And so it's okay if you don't want to answer it, I suppose. But we are having conversations in the city about putting a rather significant development next door. If you noticed when you drove in, there's a couple big fields next to City Hall. If, let's say, those were not large fields and happen to be mostly hard spaces, that is, I guess we're upriver from the large basin we're talking about. Would you expect something like that to greatly affect what is going on in your studying? I know we don't have the data to know what that would be, but assuming that that is, let's say, 80% hard surfaces and concrete as opposed to grass, how does that affect us?
Okay. I'm not going to give a specific answer of what will a development in this location do
Sure.
to your.
I get it.
But I think you've been had the expertise of Dr. Hammer, and I know that he's talked to you all about how increasing the impervious surface in a watershed is going to mean that water gets to the creek faster and less of it infiltrates down into the sponge of the sediment of the watershed, and that can cause increases in peak flows and greater erosion. It's really hard to say with any specificity without doing modeling. That is something that could be looked at with a model. So yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Are there things that you and maybe you guys don't study these things, I'm not sure. Are there techniques or whatever they're called,
permeable pavements
and things like that? I mean, do those things, are there things that we can look at doing that would really supplement what we're trying to not have happen here?
Yeah, I mean, there are options for basically slowing the flow. It's not something that we don't really get into the design aspect of those things, but you're obviously familiar with permeable pavements, rain gardens, that kind of thing. But that's kind of beyond the kind of work that we do.
But in theory, those are certainly better than not doing something.
If it gives a chance for rainfall to absorb into the ground as opposed to just running off the surface, it's going to take longer for that water to reach the channel.
Right. Yes, sir.
Potentially could be effective. Whatever that turns out, that is that these are things that we can take a look at in terms of modeling. You know, if we were to go into it. Quick comment, and I also wanted to add too to the earlier discussion that we want to be very respectful of any potential accretion that we would have in scope. Make sure it's going to be valued for that process to invest for minimal cost. We definitely have done things like that, green infrastructure model, whatever they might be, payments for different.
Yeah, that would be great. I mean, we, as a city, we feel like we're trying to do a lot of smart development, as it just so happens the available land, one of them sits at the top of Cox Creek and one of them sits at the top of Bonham Creek. And neither of those things sound great to me, but it is the places where these things are available. So I think looking into some of those things and trying to get ahead of any other new development issues that are going on would be great. So whatever help we can do with that, we'll look into that too, I guess. Can I include that in the same thing? Okay. Anybody have anything else? All righty. Thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Everybody.
We will look forward to hearing more. All right. No, not for that part. Right. Oh, yes, they'll be back. Yep. Okay. Status and next steps for our detention retention basin studies.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair, Mr. Co-chairs, Madam Co-chair, Mr. Co-chair, and members of the task force. We are making progress relative to the analysis of retrofits of certain basins upstream from all of the locations that were just discussed by Dr. Leroy. As you know, the task force has been in the lead in attempting to find solutions that are manageable as well as cost effective, given the amount of funding that we have available to assist in this regard. To summarize, Joe Wilson, Todd Wagner, and the team of Public Works and Planning have met with all of the trustees of the impacted basins that are being considered for retrofits. Without exception, all of them were willing to go to the next step in terms of the engineering analysis, and took the opportunity to basically say that they are willing and able to do whatever they can to assist. This coming Friday, Mr. Wagner will be in town and will begin that additional engineering analysis. Part of that is a responsibility of the city to engage a surveyor to assist in defining the characteristics of these basins, because the concern that Mr. Wagner has, as well as Mr. Wilson, and I think our Department of Public Works, Rick Brown and Dan Ron, is that if we do retrofits, we certainly don't want to see water in somebody's basement. And so we need to understand those elevations and all the things that go into it. So Friday, we'll begin the second step in this process, and that's that more detailed engineering analysis and moving toward what we hope to be is a set of plans that'll tell us what we can and can't do. So progress is being made.
Awesome. Is there anything you additionally need from us on that front?
No, sir. You've all been very helpful, and you've given us good direction that we've passed on to the two consultants. And as I say, the response from the trustees and the homeowners association, including Mr. Farmer, who is a trustee in his subdivision, has been very, very positive.
Awesome. All right. Does anybody have any questions about the basins? We're gonna get some more info on that soon.
Is the work they're doing with the surveyor going to maybe tighten down these estimates a little bit? We're at like minus 25 to plus 50, so that's a little hard to.
Yes.
Okay.
I think that's the key component, is just understanding first and foremost some of the elevations associated with the basins themselves, And as it's been explained to me by Mr. Wagner, the intent here is to do modifications to it, but within the context of what's reasonable or not reasonable. So the engineered plans will tell us the answers we need.
Yes, sir.
Are you going to look at all of them or just some of them?
Ultimately, there were 7 basins
Right.
that were identified, and all of them will be on his site visit this coming Friday and part of Saturday.
Okay, because his initial report to us said some of them had high, low vulnerability and some of them were good. I just didn't know if you were going to go to the high ones first or.
Yes, actually, we talked to more of the subdivisions relative to some of the basins to get authorization for that initial kind of review. So like Windcrest, Brentmore Place, they've dropped off because they had a
Right.
very low to low medium
Okay.
probability of success. And so we decided not to expend resources where even if we did the work, it wouldn't necessarily have the impact we're hoping.
So if you do the engineering on the several of them, then he's able to come back to us with the engineering information on other stuff that we have. We think these 3 should be the top priorities or something like that.
Yes, what ultimately I hope you'll have is 7 plans that
Okay.
indicate what basins actually can be retrofit without doing any harm
Okay.
and actually have the impact that we all hope for the money we spend.
Okay. Thank you.
All right. Anybody else? Okay.
It seems that there's, 5. In fact, they even, summarize, here's 5, and that's subtotal. Should we be holding our powder on analysis on kind of eliminating these lows before we go forward with the next step and, having more money for more detailed design and getting further with the other ones that are more likely to make the cut?
But I would urge us to stay with the course we've selected based upon Todd Wagner and Joe
Okay.
Wilson's recommendations.
Yeah.
2 of the basins are in Copper Lakes, 3 are in Town Center. The other 2 are singular ones in the harbors and West Glen Farms. And probably most interesting amongst that is the one in the harbors, which is the upper lake, not the larger lake, and the one in West Glen Farms actually seem to have the greatest potential because they have what we anticipate is the largest amount of available capacity, whereas some of the others may not. So it's a good question, Ms. Holthouse, but I guess I'd like to pull that thread a little more with Mr. Wagner on this next step before we would say, okay, let's start whittling the number down even more.
Asked and answered. Thank you.
Awesome. All right. Updates on projects.
Well, for the most part, it's not something that's on the memorandum, but we did get some very good news of late, and it involves the state legislature. As you know, over the course of time, Mr. Sturman and all of the task force members, along with team members here at the city, have been trying to find a solution to our funding problem. And lo and behold, we started with our legislative consultant, and I believe he's been successful. So I was going to ask Mr. Lee to kind of explain what's going on and the good news we have.
Thank you, Mr. Vunich. And Mr. Chair, if you don't mind me stepping in here for a second.
Absolutely.
This is some great news. I've been working, Joe's been working, Rick's been working, the entire team has been working with Mr. Silverman, our legislative consultant, with the state legislature to help get additional funding for watershed mediation, watershed management and erosion mediation. And I'm very enthused and very excited to tell you all that last Friday on May 5th, 2023, both chambers of the Missouri State Legislature truly agreed to and finally passed HB 19. HB 19 effectively apportions $500K or $500,000 to the city of Wildwood for watershed erosion, watershed and stormwater management, along with erosion mediation, provided that the city matches that $500,000 at a 25% clip. That would mean the city would have to contribute $120,000 towards this fund. That being said, that would bring the grand total to $620,000 for the fiscal year of 2023, going into 2024 for the city to use on these means. At this moment, they're passed. Just to give you a breakdown, 142 members of the legislature said yes, let's do it. 4 did say no. The bill right now is currently sitting on the governor's desk waiting for a signature. The governor does have 45 days to pass or veto the bill. This is a part of a larger measure of the budget that goes into multiple different facets, but specifically a lot of these different apportionments were for the Department of Natural Resources, which where this would be coming from, specifically the Budget Stabilization Fund from the Department of Natural Resources. That being said, if you want to look it up yourselves, everyone, HB 19 section 19.381 provides this. And at this moment, our legislative consultant at the behest of the city has reached out to the governor's office and reached out to their budget staff to ensure that we will be spending this money appropriately, and it's much needed. We are confident that the governor will sign this legislation, and we'll most likely have an update on this legislation if it was passed or vetoed, but we're feeling good about this by the next meeting. If you have any questions, I have quite a bit of information on this and be more than happy to break it out a little bit further. So I'll open up the floor to everyone, but I think great news, guys, and I think we all deserve a pat on the back for this one. I'm really happy to announce this today.
It's exciting news. All right. Anybody have any questions on the bill that is hopefully going to get us a little bit of money?
No, I don't have a question about the bill, but I have a question about how does that figure in terms of ending up the total amount of money that we now have available? Wasn't there some that had already been set aside in the city?
Right.
Then we have to provide some matching out of that, I presume.
That
Out
is
of that, I presume. What do we end up with? I'm thinking that we end up with more than what Mr. Lee said. Is that correct?
Well, we spent some of it already, so there's a little bit in that. It wasn't the total amount that we started with, which I believe was at 750 at the beginning of the year.
$750,000.
So we sent, but yeah, I mean, it'll be a nice little chunk of change that's coming, and
so
hopefully it's just the beginning.
Whatever the 750 or 700 or whatever it is now plus this.
Yes. So in that,
700.
yeah.
Please.
Sorry about that, Joe.
Is that right?
Oh, what I was
Okay,
going to
Mr.
say was with this, we would have to pay that 120,000 out of it, out of
Right.
that fund that we're talking, but we would get 500,000 from the state to bring it in. So it would just be practically, if you want to look at this at a net income level, that would be a plus 500,000 to the current fund.
Got it. Thank you.
And
You're welcome.
And with the chair's permission, before the meeting began tonight, I placed at your seats this little handout. This was requested by Mr. Silverman as part of his effort to discuss the matter with the legislators in the House and Senate. And for the most part, what we identified as part of our pitch was that we would have approximately $500,000 available to match any of the funds that might be available from the state legislature. Doing the math, we started the year with $750,000. We've expended or committed about $250,000 to our engineering analyses, et cetera, the contracts we have with Mr. Wilson, Mr. Wagner. So both Steve Cross, at the time our city administrator, Rick Brown, our director of public works, and I felt that we could comfortably assure the state legislature that we had about $500,000 if push came to shove. So if you do the math now, what's either been committed or spent of that original $750,000, we have about $500,000, of which $120,000 will go toward the matching, but we also now have another $500,000, so a total of $1 million.
Yep. So thanks to Mr. Sturman, who worked very hard rattling some cages, and our city staff, and to Mr. Silverman, who has been working very hard on these things. I know Sometimes at the council level, we have conversations about our political consultants worth the spend and things like that. Hopefully this is the first of many small pieces that will indicate that it's important for the city to have representation on the ground at the Capitol. So we're super excited about it, and hopefully we'll get some more things here moving forward as well. So excellent news. Thank you, Mr. Lee, for sharing that with everybody.
Not a problem. Hey, Mr. Chair, do you mind if I add one other thing too, just to kind of emphasize what you just said? Yeah,
Please.
no, I just wanted to mention a little bit of the background here, and it does kind of shed light on the fact that it is good to have boots on the ground over in Jeff City to get our voices heard, our city's voice heard, because there were two different versions of this bill, one coming from the House, one coming from the Senate. The Senate version of the bill had this 75-25% match. On the other side, it was the House bill that had a 50-50 match. It was a very contentious debate. Budget season, with the session ending this week, it's been a hectic week down in Jeff City and in the preceding weeks as well. But luckily, with the consulting and being able to get our point across of why we need these funds and the importance of it, we were able to get the more favorable terms when it comes to the city. So just wanted to give another highlight there, just because there were two versions, and just very grateful for the state and all the legislators that were able to endorse this cause, which is very, very important to all of us.
Yeah, that was great. So was it Senator Schatz that put that through then?
That was, so the actual sponsor of the bill was, sorry about that. I had this right in front of me. I think it was Representative Cody. It was Representative Cody Smith, the 163rd district. He's a House representative. From the Senate side, I would have to look into that, but
it's okay.
Yeah, but he is the sponsor of the bill, and the co-sponsors, there were no co-sponsors at all. So it was, I think we had to give Representative Cody Smith a welcome, a round of applause, because he's the one championing this cause, and a couple other legislators, from what I've heard from Mr. Silverman, have been a big part of this as well. So excellent news all around.
Well, thanks to all of those representatives that helped us, and we will be sure to track and monitor what we're doing with this money so we can show what we can do, and hopefully that'll help us get more so we can do even more things. That would be great. Yes, sir.
Is it appropriate or not appropriate, just as we were talking about Mr. Silverman or whatever his name, for us to respond as a task force to him and say that we're real live people and that we're working on this, and that we just wanted to send you a note of thank you for the work that you've done. That's going to mean a lot to our city. Thanks very much. WETF or whatever it is. I don't know if it's appropriate or not.
I think a thank you for a job well done is always appropriate.
I do too.
And I believe Mr. Silverman would probably appreciate it because he grew up in the city of Wildwood and knows it intimately. So if there's no objection from Mr. Lee, I think we could craft a draft of a thank you letter, run it through you all via email, send it on its way, and let him know that he did a job well done.
Yeah, that's fine. If you think it's appropriate, I think it's always helpful.
Yeah, I think it's a great idea.
Yeah, not only that, I think that, oh, sorry, Mr. Punich.
Go ahead. Sure.
I was going to say, not
Mr. Lee.
only that to Mr. Silverman, but I think it might even be appropriate to send a letter to the legislators, addressing all the legislators that voted yes, the ayes, if you will, for this legislation specifically too. And we could certainly draft that.
Great plan. All right, Mr. Vunich, what else we got?
Just a couple more items. The Watershed Management Master Plan. Mr. Ron and the Department of Planning are working on that RFQ, request for qualifications. We have tentatively set the timeline for the RFQ and draft form to be to the Watershed Erosion Task Force for review and comments and ultimately endorsement. We'd like to get it out before the end of this year, which would probably mean early fall, and then proceed forward with that project at the beginning of fiscal year 2024. So from a budget standpoint, Mr. Farmer and Ms. Edens will have that hopefully for discussion purposes in the fall.
All right.
Again, and then just one more thing. As you know, we have done an estimate on the retrofits of the basins. Even with 7 of them being included, if the engineering says that's appropriate, we will have some excess funds. We do have a list of projects, some of which could be encompassed now with the additional monies we've received. As you know, we've looked at the triple meander, which is the most expensive of the grouping of 6, but we also have 5 others that, from the perspective of the department, may be reasonable to consider. For example, Evergreen Forest Court, where we have that erosion problem threatening at least 1, if not more homes. Community Park, where we know we've got an issue near our playground area. So I'm kind of forewarning you that I think there's going to be a point here in the next couple of months where the departments will be presenting to you some ideas of how we might proceed forward with a project or 2 beyond the retrofit.
Yeah, it has sort of come to my attention that especially in Evergreen, where we certainly have one house that is in some trouble, much like we're seeing with some of our studies, that seems to have started to pretty quickly expand to some other pieces of property as well. So I think bring a few options and let's see what we can do. I mean, I think a key thing for our task force, especially now that we've been around for a few years and hoping for money, now that we have some, let's get some shovels in the ground, so to speak, on some things.
And from the perspective of the departments, Public Works and Planning, to the task force members, we're not doing this on the spur of the moment. As you know, this is our 34th meeting. We spent probably 25 of those meetings getting to this point where we know the problem areas, we know the cost estimates for those problem areas, and we have some concepts engineering wise to address them. So it's not that we haven't prepared the foundation well. Now it's time, I think, to actually go out and do some of the things we've hoped to do for the past 3+ years.
Could not agree more.
I just have one comment to you. Thank you for bringing that forward. It's always good to know that somebody's thinking with us about what's next and what we do. So that in my mind, just personally, bringing that forward and saying we have some suggestions on what else we could do, I think it's very helpful to us. And so I joined this task force later, and I see for the 34 meetings, I understand that. But we do have a path forward. And I think that piece that you're bringing helps us move and keep the other projects not separate, but keep them in focus. But now we have, after 34 meetings, at least a place to go. My point is, I want to thank you for bringing that forward and for the things for us to look at.
Well, it's a group that's bringing it forward. I can assure you of that. But I think at some point here in the near term, we may have 3 active projects: the retrofit of the basins, the master plan, and then some repairs in actual locations where we've identified them as critical.
Yep, that's great. Okay, anything on the work program?
Just to the task force members, if you have any questions on any of the items that have been identified with updates, Mr. Newberry and I are available to try to respond to them.
Anybody have anything? All righty. Then it looks like last but not least, bank stabilization through tree planting.
And to the co-chairs and task force members, this was something that was discussed from the perspective of the minutes near the end of our last meeting in January. It was something that I'll admit I kind of overlooked when I was preparing the agenda, as Holthouse caught it. So I know you've got a little kind of a funky voice, but maybe if you'd like to set the stage, and then whatever you as task force members would like to do, we'll certainly can start that process and have hopefully tangible updates for you at the next meeting.
And I think it dovetails nicely with the analysis we've asked the USGS to do on bank stabilization. that they can probably give us some idea of what kind of impact that could have, just like they're giving us an idea of what the detention basin can do, and, would be investing someplace where we knew, it would or wouldn't make a big difference. The one question I had, just because the two things intersected in my inbox in a relatively short period of time, so I could remember them. There was like a Arbor Day sapling giveaway, and I just wondered what kind of participation that had, what kind of cost there was to the city, whether those are easy to do or hard to do. It's kind of like, what is the impact is one question, but is it really easy or really hard? And so many of the things we've done have been really found to do are really hard. So I was just wondering if tree planting is something that might be easy.
From the standpoint of the city, MDC provides the saplings at almost no cost to us. It's a very popular program. We basically did it on a single day between 8 a.m. and 4:30 p.m. We had a lot of people show up and took saplings. We also provided information on how to plant a sapling and the care necessary for a sapling like that. And hopefully we'll see success. And it's easy. So certainly it's something that we could do more often if the task force wanted us to consider such.
Well, at a minimum, I'd suggest the next time we're doing one that maybe we pull together a little flyer that talks about how important trees are in terms of retaining, slowing down stormwater and stabilizing banks, just so people can make the connection. And,
Excellent suggestion. And
okay.
I wish we would have done it a couple of weeks ago.
I wish I would have done it a couple of weeks ago, along with a lot of other things as well. So, no, not try. And it's fair to throw it back and say, great idea, Carol. Why don't you work on that?
So from that perspective, when like Dan, Travis, Rick, and I talked to the USGS about the amendment or expansion of the study, do we want to ask them about, is there some way to integrate these tree plantings and programs like that? Or I just want to, it's something I think most people can do and be willing to do. So I don't want to just leave it on the agenda and move from it. Is there direction you want us to do it on our own, as just maybe look into it, get some research done, talk to some arborists, just let us know and we'll see what we can come up with.
I think in terms of the USGS scope, if they could maybe just take some areas that have similar soil profiles and characteristics, and I would think it wouldn't be terribly hard to say, and if there's trees holding all that together, it does X, and if there's not trees there holding it together, it does Y. And if we plant a tree today, it's not going to be something that stabilizes a bank for a long time to come, but I think again, it just gives you some idea of the impact.
Mr. Sturman.
I should know the answer, I guess, to my question, but this tree planting is meant to help stabilize banks. And my question is in what location on the bank are we planting those trees to, is it near or setback? Is it on top?
That's a
Or
good question.
I've always wondered I just was wondering where they're being placed and their function sort of from an engineering or from a bank stabilization.
And my understanding which is, what came from the weekly newsletter, is that there's no direction on this in terms of where you plant them. It's just trees are good, plant them where you will.
Oh, so it's a general.
Yeah, it's a general.
Because along and around Point Clayton, we watch, anytime you go out there, periodically, there's another tree or trees that have fallen in. And so it does look like a tree on the edge of the bank does anything except eventually fall over.
Mr. Lee.
Yes, I was just going to point out, I do not know necessarily where exactly they are planting them, but from my understanding of the mediation of what these trees do, having a tree there, supposedly it's the roots. Having roots within the ground stabilizes that dirt, the soil. And if you don't have that tree there, it's more so of just not having vegetation, because when you don't have vegetation, that soil is less compact and it doesn't have that hard network of not vines, roots that keep it secure. That's what I've gotten from my research into it. And again, I am not an engineer, but from my understanding, it helps with the hardening of that ground and keeping it more stable. Thank you.
Mr. Delante.
Mr. Vunich, do you know whether or not this tree stabilization, saplings and so on is even part of USGS? Do they do that?
I don't know. That's why, if with your permission, we'll delve into that with them and see if that's a component of the current study, because I don't know all aspects of the current study. And if not, can it be part of this expanded study?
Right. And this ties into what Ms. Edens asked in terms of hooking together. I'm finding out watching this, all of these businesses now have everything is in the next step. I'm finding a lot of next steps. You get, well, we can do that, but it'll be step 2 of our project, which will cost you. My point being is that what she had suggested was hooking together kind of a next step. And I didn't know whether the arbor thing or trees was even within the purview of what they do. And if not, then when they bring steps or you bring next steps, I don't know whether it's part of it or separate or whatever. That's it, my thinking.
Well, I was just going to add to that separately, parallel, but it really should intersect. We have an update to our tree planting guide, but the way I see it in my mind is this is the opportunity to have an additional, lack of a better word, spinoff chapter on sustainable plantings. I mean, from lectures that I sat through on native Missouri species, I learned that native grasses in Missouri absorb 7 inches of rainfall at one time. So I have, residents that I've talked to that have a field over in the Highlands. And one of the discussions that we had is what would really help you is to essentially rip up this grass and plant native species that absorb the rainfall better. And that's a debate that they're kind of having because there's mowing costs and certain looks that they want, and they're concerned about snakes and all kinds of stuff. But what they really need is help with resources and kind of, we need to be a partner that can help communities that are considered, in a critical need zone plan to make better choices and be a partner that points them to the right direction, provides resources and says, here's what we'd like you to plant. So that's essentially what they're asking for. And those, the trustees are not horticultural specialists. I've emailed them things before. It kind of went nowhere, but I mean, we could be doing a little bit more in that regard. And I heard you say honeysuckle too. I mean, we know that we need to rip it up because it has a toxin in its roots that affects the growth of other, low-lying forest species that also absorb rainfall. So we've got an educational component, but I see no reason why we can't have a written addition to that tree code as our guide.
Well, we know our at least 5 critical locations, the 6 being our retrofit program. So we have locations. And so if we want to target resources, information resources.
Yeah. And I was even thinking, I mean, there are small grant programs and we wouldn't need, I mean, maybe the HOA could do it, that it's sort of this like back to a traditional field style grant. So that's a perfect example of a giant open field that maybe, the HOA could get a grant for to sort of repopulate with a better species. Whether that's Department of Conservation or a foundation like Mo Prairie could probably be a good resource on that.
We'll take a look at it for you.
Yeah, that's what I'm thinking.
Mr. Delani, you got something else? Are you good? All right. Anybody else? Okay.
Thank you.
One real, you don't have to be at the podium. I can just say this from the trustee perspective. I think everybody up here is right about that. I think it would be great if we could just put together a very simple guide for homeowners and trustees of HOAs to help them understand simple things they can do, whether it's tell your landscaping crew to cut the grass 5 feet beyond where they used to, just let the grass come in there, or put in these kinds of grasses or put in these trees. I mean, it's where we're at in the springtime. On my drive down Cawks Creek, the entire thing is full of honeysuckle. So we're going to have a hard time getting much of anything to grow in there until that comes out. And we can't take that out until something else is growing. So we're kind of stuck. So I think basic landscaping plans, basic ideas, maybe the city can, get a bucket of saplings, or we can talk to our partners that have bigger trees. I mean, I'm thinking certainly in winding trails where they're losing a huge amount of ground every time it rains, putting something there or letting the grass grow longer. If that's as simple as they can work it, that'd be great. I mean, these HOAs don't have unlimited funds and they don't have unlimited volunteers to go plant stuff. So we're going to have to kind of take them kicking and screaming.
Well, there are other entities like Forest Relief that provide plantings. They're more than saplings. There is a small charge associated with them, but they're a great organization and they do a lot of positive things in the metropolitan area. So we can explore that as well.
I think just giving a simple thing that gives them as many options as possible. And also, not necessarily a warning, but just say, hey, we've spent a lot of time and energy studying this. It's not, we have other things we have to be expending our finances on to fix. These are things you guys can do. And the city maybe partners with them. If a tree costs, $5, then split it or whatever it is. I mean, it should be pretty minimal money, but I think we should be able to do that kind of a thing sooner rather than later. Whatever the USGS can do is great, but some of these things are pretty simple. Just, don't cut the grass, plant these things back there. We've talked a little bit about not putting branches and yard waste in the backs of yards. An educational campaign would be great in that space.
Well, we have that do's and don'ts that you all endorsed after it was prepared by the Departments of Public Works and Planning. But I think I know it almost could be just, I have some ideas. Why don't you let us put our heads together? We'll get it out to you. You all can basically do the edits like you've done before that have improved the documents immensely. And then we'll go from there.
Awesome. All right. Anybody have anything else? No? All right. Then a motion to adjourn would be fantastic. Made by Ms. Edens, seconded by Mr. Sturman. Non-debatable. All those ready to say goodnight for the evening, please say aye. Aye. Anybody abstain? Too bad. And nobody gets to disagree. We'll see you again in a few months, I imagine, right? Or a month and a half.
Also, I'll be sure to keep everyone informed on that bill. Just a heads up, everyone. But thank you so much.
That'll be great. All right. We'll see you guys soon. Thank you, everybody, for coming.